Welcome to the latest Reaction subscriber event. I'm delighted we're joined this evening by Professor Robert Toombs, Professor of French History at Cambridge. If you enjoyed The English and Their History, his book published in 2014, you are going to love his new book, which is out tomorrow. So happy publication dates tomorrow. The Sovereign Isle, Britain in and out of Europe. Robert, welcome.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Now, if you haven't, watching this at home, if you haven't ordered this book, I suggest that you do so. We can, obviously the logistics are complicated because of COVID and all that. We can order signed copies for subscribers. And if you are interested, please email us at editors@reaction.life, and one of the team will arrange that for you. Robert, this is a short but very important book. It's an attempt to put Brexit in historical context. Do you think? I know you're dealing with the historical long view, and it packs a lot into what's a short, very punchy book, 165 pages. But do you think has sufficient time passed since 2016 and the referendum to make considered historical judgment?
Well, in a way, no, because considered historical judgments need to know how the story ends, and we're still only at the beginning of the end, I think. We don't know what's going to happen to the EU. Of course, for its supporters, it's going on from strength to strength. It's going to become consolidated into some sort of confederation. It's going to have a European government that will decide its economic policy. It will have a European defense structure and an army, all that, become one of the great powers of this century. Or if you take the view of people rather more like me, it's heading into a period of insoluble and increasing problems. Its financial system is shaky and has already done huge damage to Southern Europe in particular. It's sapping the strength away from its elected national governments and shifting power into an unelected oligarchy. It's producing increasing political discontent across Europe, and hence its future is very much in doubt. I don't mean to say it's doomed to collapse, but when I say in doubt, that's what I mean. We don't know what its future will be. So I think, whether in 30 years' time, Brexit comes to be seen as, the rearguard action of an aging nationalism, or the sort of canary in the coal mine of the decline and fall of the EU. At the moment, we can't see. I think that we can judge the Brexit process itself, I think, and we can judge the period that leads up to it, which I suppose is the last 30 years. Now, I think reasonably well.
Now, you might be thought an unlikely leaver, and you were, in some senses, a reluctant leaver. What persuaded you, a professor of French history, to vote to leave the European Union?
Well, one of my colleagues said to me, "I hear you're a Brexiteer," he said, "but I always thought you were such a nice chap." And your wife's French, he said, which is, it's certainly true that my wife is French. What made me decide? Well, I thought the EU was going in a direction that we wouldn't follow and wouldn't want to follow, or at least it was attempting to do so. It was attempting to become more centralized, and that to me meant less democratic. I mean, I don't think that, there's the facade of democracy in the EU, but I don't think one can seriously consider it a democratic structure. And yet it was wanting to become effectively the government of Europe, and there's no secret about that. So I thought that was something we wouldn't want, and ought not to want. But I did think for a time that Cameron would get some sort of compromise. That our position within the EU was unstable and unsatisfactory from everyone's point of view, and that we would have some sort of with goodwill on both sides, which of course one can't, we realize now, assume, that there would be some sort of compromise deal, which would mean that we would not be expected to sign up to the idea of ever closer union. There'd be some sort of limit on free movement. There'd be some sort of guarantee for the City of London and the British economy outside the Eurozone. And of course, then none of that happened. So I think then it became clear that we were on the outside and heading away from, we were a satellite that was spinning away from the Brussels sun. And I thought in that case, to leave would be the opportunity of rethinking our relationship with the EU and doing so on a more satisfactory basis. I mean, that was probably a bit naive because I was still thinking, it's in both sides' interests to have a stable and cooperative relationship. And therefore, once we voted to leave, the EU will accept that, of course, that our own people would accept it, and therefore we would get on to negotiating something better. Mm. As we all now know, things were much more complicated than that. And so people say, some people say, well, weren't Brexiteers naive to think it was going to be easy? Well, I think probably most of us thought it was going to be easier, but then I don't think anyone could predict all the extraordinary complications that set in after the referendum vote.
And how late in the process did you decide? I mean, I had a similar experience to your experience. I think I was only definitely decided to vote to leave, and I had quite a lot of doubts. I think early in the year of the referendum itself, when the renegotiation with Brussels failed, as I saw it, and what Cameron came back with didn't work. I broadly took the view, I don't know if you agree, that this was a one-off chance, that we weren't going to be asked again. We were asked by a process of historical accidents because of the Eurozone crisis, Cameron, what happened with migration, that if we didn't give it a go and we didn't grab the opportunity, it wouldn't be asked again in the next 25 or 30 years.
Yeah. Well, I did dither. And partly because of fear of the outcome, thinking, who is actually going to take responsibility for this? Who within the state, which politicians, which civil servants will carry it out? But what I mentioned in the book, there were two moments that I remember that made me decide firmly that I would vote to leave. And one was an open meeting in Cambridge, in which I was in the audience, and I asked one of the speakers whether it would not be better for us to stay in the EU and see how things developed. And he said, which was really a pretty stupid question, because for the reason that you've said. And as he said to me, well, we have to vote now. There's no guarantee we'll ever get another vote. So that was one thing. And the other thing, which I also mentioned in the introduction, is I happened to be asked to dinner at a friend's house, colleagues and friend's house, where another guest was a Nobel Prize winning economist, an American, who had recently written a letter in the Times, a collective letter he'd signed, saying that he opposed Brexit. And so I said to him, do you think it's really going to be an economic disaster? And he said, no, it won't be a disaster. He said it will need some adjustments, but no disaster. And that, in a sense, someone who is regarded as one of the great economists of the 20th century, reassured me that Project Fear was a fake, or at least, I don't judge those who believed it, but that it was simply a huge exaggeration and an attempt to intimidate the electorate into voting in a particular way.
But you also didn't. It's fascinating. You didn't really like the wilder claims made by more fanatical leavers that this was, the reverse image of Project Fear was that this was all going to be marvelous and sunlit uplands and instantly glorious and reinvent the country.
Yeah, I'm not sure that all that many people did say that, though. Perhaps I didn't take enough notice. I mean, I did become one of the fanatical leavers, probably, or at least I developed a pretty strong view that we should carry out the popular vote. But what I remember going to a talk, in fact, this was another thing, that this was before the vote. I think it was the first ever meeting I went to on this, in which Martin Howe, QC, lawyer, well-known lawyer, and indeed Brexit campaigner eventually, said what we need to do is to say to the EU, we're going to leave. We're very happy to trade with you on WTO terms, but if you would like to propose something better, some closer relationship, we're very happy to listen. And I do think that would have been the right thing to do, and that would have been the simple. Well, of course, in a sense, we almost got to that in the end. But had we done that from the beginning, then I think we would have saved ourselves 3 years of confusion. But of course, for the reasons that we all know, that was not the original policy adopted by Her Majesty's government.
There's a very good description of what ensued, and so much has happened in the last year that it was fascinating to see it recapped. And it is quite incredible that the vote happened and that there was then a sustained effort to prevent its implementation.
Yes,
regardless of one's views. I'd just rereading the book that I'd almost sort of lost sight of how incredible it is that it nearly worked.
Yes, it did. And it seems to me that had it worked, we would no longer really have been a sovereign democracy. Whatever the law said, although in theory we were always free to leave, or Parliament could always have repealed the European Communities Act, if the referendum vote had been in one way or another overturned, that would have meant that we were no longer capable of exercising a democratic sovereign choice. And that, I think, that seemed to me to become the most important issue, much more so than the details of trade negotiations, but whether or what sort of country we were and what sort of system of government we now had.
What do you make of where we've now ended up? There is a Brexit deal. Britain's fully out of the European Union, but there's no getting around it. There seem to be some pretty serious problems related to trade facilitation and paperwork, and that doesn't seem to be going away. Do you accept the criticism of people who wanted to remain, that say that essentially the deal is a bad deal, and that we're going to be dogged by these problems for years?
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone thinks it's a very good deal, and I don't think it's the best deal we could, in theory, have had. But then it was the only deal that it was probably the best deal that was available by 2019. People often say, well, people who regret Brexit often say, oh well, the Brexiteers are trying to blame other people now. This is what was always going to happen, and it's their fault. Well, to go back to the point Martin Howe made, we did not start off in the position that most Brexiteers would have supported. I mean, I agree that no one had not many people had a very clear idea of what exactly the referendum vote entailed, partly because the government had refused to do any planning for it. But we weren't. I think people were not sure. Did this mean a sort of Norway-style arrangement, or did it mean membership of EFTA, or did it mean WTO terms, and so on? And in the end, we had to get to the final point by a sort of process of elimination, or sort of Darwinian process of survival. But it can't be pretended, I think, that the Johnson government, or even the May government, was put in the ideal negotiating position by its parliament or its parliaments, or by its civil service, or by the political class as a whole. I think it made it extremely difficult for them to negotiate for the country, because the EU was constantly being told that this vote was going to be reversed. Indeed, a friend who lives in France was saying to me the other day, the EU still believes that it was all down to the Boris bus. They still don't really believe that this was a legitimate vote. And of course, they were encouraged in this belief by a great many of the great and the good of our own country, who, I'm willing to accept that their views were entirely sincere, but nevertheless, I think that they did a great deal of damage by undermining their own government's position.
Why do you think then? Why did the British vote to leave? I mean, you say in the book that taking the long historical view, that actually the continent and the affairs of the continent have not really been our main preoccupation
Yeah.
or focus, so that the roots of this are very, very deep and shouldn't really have surprised people. As you say, you make the case that the biggest surprise is that the vote was so narrow.
Yes. I mean, what I'm trying to argue is that is really against historical determinism. The argument on one hand that, Britain is a European country and therefore is predestined to be a member of the EU, and not to be in the EU, therefore, or to leave the EU, is flying in the face of history and historical necessity and the way that the world is going. I don't believe that. But nor would I say that we were predestined to leave. I mean, there are things in our history that mean, very obviously, that we were less committed deep down to the European project than were many people on the continent. The obvious reasons are, their experience of the 20th century, which was so appalling compared with ours. And also because, another obvious reason, we have connections outside the European continent, far more extensive than, I think, it's not very controversial to say, more extensive and more important than any other European country. And hence our commitment to the idea of a European destiny was less strong. So that's where I'd say history, means that we're at least marginal. And in that sense, I think, I'd compare us to Norway or Switzerland. We're not really in the middle of, we're not in the heart of Europe. The fact is, we're a bit on the edges. But I mean, the other thing I try to say, which I think is a sort of heresy in a way, is that we would not have voted to leave had we been in the Eurozone, first of all, because the risks would have been too great. So however much people would have complained about the EU, many people would have complained, however many people might have felt that this was not our historical destiny, we would nevertheless have been stuck in it and would not have been able to get out of it. And so that's one of my points. And another point is that if you look at not so much at, the long-term historical process, but how people in 2016 thought about the EU, you find that opinions in Britain were not very different from those in other parts of Europe. Indeed, I say in the book that the referendum vote was a very European vote. British opinion about the EU was pretty well in the middle, almost exactly the same as in Germany. We were more pro-EU or less anti-EU than France or Italy or especially Greece. So, the obvious question is, well, why is it us who voted to leave? And, you said at the beginning, it's partly because we were given a vote, which European politicians would go to almost any lengths not to concede to their own people. And also that we were not in the Eurozone. So if you're a Greek, you might loathe the EU, but feel that trying to leave it would be disastrous. Mm-hmm. We didn't loathe the EU. We're not very enthusiastic about it, but we felt that if we wanted to leave it, we could, or at least that's how the majority felt. Of course, as you suggested earlier, there was a substantial minority that did not feel that at all, and that was, that was the political problem.
How do you feel about France? I mean, you're a historian of France, and as you explain really clearly, that story of conflict with France, or stress and strain with sort of Anglo-French conflict, is a key part of the story. I mean, I tend to now, in defense terms, this is the great irony, that one of the biggest stories of the last 10 years is increasing French and British cooperation on defense, and increasingly on security and intelligence, separate from the whole European business, although the European Union and parts of the French establishment would like it to be the same thing and embed us in European structures, but that hasn't really happened. But it is the most bizarre. It's one of the most bizarre aspects of the story, isn't it? We're simultaneously getting further away from France and closer.
Yes. Which is not new, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're a bit like quarreling siblings. In many ways, Britain and France are quite similar, not only in size, wealth, power, and all that, but even culturally. You know, you can point to big differences, but I think there are also quite considerable similarities. But one of the most important is the preoccupation of many people in both France and Britain with the reputation and influence of their country, and also within the political class, at least, a determination to play a big role in the world. And for both Britain and France, that was the I would even say the main reason behind joining or setting up, in the case of France, and joining it later in our case, of the European economic communities. It was a pedestal for France and Britain to maintain a role in the world after the loss of their empires. And I think we changed our mind and the French didn't. And so I think today the French, the quite remarkable and to me rather upsetting degree of Anglophobia expressed publicly in France since Brexit is because this is their great project, which we are damaging. And also, I sort of suspect, this is a bit of cod psychology, if you like, that we've done something that many French people would like to do, but haven't got the haven't got the guts to do, or don't feel that they can actually really do. You know, there are a lot of people in France who would like France to leave the EU, but they feel that it just cannot be done. And now we've done it. And I think that for that reason, it makes resentment against Brexit all the greater. You may remember, I don't know whether you saw him, Emmanuel Macron was on the Andrew Marr show I think in 2018. And he said he knew that most people in France wanted a referendum on EU membership, and that he thought that they would vote to leave, or at least he said it would be a very difficult referendum to win. And I think many people in Britain don't realize the extent to which there are people on the continent who would like to have done what we do, but just don't think that they can. And it must be very annoying. You know, the French voted against the 2005 constitution, but it happened all the same.
The argument, though, for the EU is partly about scale and clout, that the world is dividing into these great power blocks.
Yeah.
Now the European Union can make its own trade, by which I mean political or diplomatic play with China, do it and defy the incoming Biden administration. And it's an emerging regulatory and legal superpower, and we're now outside it and sort of lost and adrift. Though, I mean, the events of the last few weeks on vaccines don't necessarily fit with that theory.
No, quite. Again, is a reason why I think for the intense annoyance, because it should have been the case that the EU, as this great powerful bloc acting together, would be able to set its own terms. And we see once again that the EU as a system turns out to be very weak, and not at all competent, and has seen Britain steal a march. You know, the fact that we're being accused of doing so in an improper and underhand way, whereas as far as I can see from what I read in the papers, this was done perfectly legitimately, and there is no reproach against either Britain or AstraZeneca. It just shows, I think, the intense frustration that that many people in at least within the EU, within EU circles now feel. Because it does, as you rightly say, it makes the EU look extremely silly, and of course it weakens its attractions to its citizens, who are always being told that the EU makes them better off or gives them more clout in the world, as you say, and it doesn't seem that it does, or at least it hasn't so far.
But do you think Brexiteers are sometimes prone to, or Eurosceptics in the UK, to predicting the fall of the EU over and over again? I mean, there's a Eurosceptic friend of mine who says says he's worn out sandwich boards, marching around saying the end of the EU is nigh. I mean, I did wonder when you started to see riots in Holland about COVID lockdown. There are clearly tensions there, but it's likely, because of the euro, it's likely to weather that, isn't it? Stay together in some form.
Yes. Oh, I mean, I think it may well be, in a sense, reduced to the eurozone. I mean, what's the EU doing anymore other than try to maintain its single currency?
Yeah.
I mean, one American historian of the EU said something like, the EU is no longer run by its peoples or its parliament; it's run by a bank board. And sometimes you think that's not too much of an exaggeration.
Yeah, I think that's the real danger inherent in what's happening with the vaccine story, and I think it's why, if the EU can't fix this, certainly hope that they do, for some friends and neighbours on the continent. Then, if you can't be a vaccinated nation, I'm not saying the vaccine is the answer to everything, but you can't really get your economy going properly again until you're vaccinated. And if these time lags are as long as they appear to be, and the Commission have really messed up the procurement process, then that's when you fairly rapidly, later in the year, get potentially into a eurozone crisis, simply because of the impact on the banking system, which is not particularly robust anyway. European banking system needs a fairly rapid recovery. So that I think that's why now the Commission and the European Union establishment are scrambling like mad, because they realize what they've done, which is.
I think so too. But as you say, we've been predicting this for ages, and in some ways, it's a miracle that it's still there. And the reason is, of course, one reason is that there's no obvious way out. You know, what do you do? You're stuck with the eurozone, even if you think it's not good for your country or good for you, but you can't get out of it without taking huge risks. And then, of course, there is the huge political commitment that's been made by the great majority of Europe's political class or political classes. How are they going to say, oh, well, actually, this wasn't such a good idea after all. We're going to try and wind the whole thing up. There's no way that could be done either. And then, of course, for many people, well, I'm not sure how for many people, certainly for more people in Europe than in Britain. You know, I don't know what a guess would be, 20, 30% of people. This is really a project to which they are attached emotionally, and partly because of their fear of what might happen. You know, that will we go back to the 1930s? You know, will Europe be once again a continent of conflicting states? You know, will our democracy survive? You know, things that we're not really all that worried about here, because we haven't had to worry about them very much in the past. So I think the idea that there could be some sort of intergovernmental conference which would say, well, look, chaps, it hasn't really worked very well, has it? Let's dissolve the EU. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So it could be. I mean, there could be some sort of catastrophic end, which we would all be terribly alarmed by, because it would affect everybody. Yes. But I think more likely is that there will be some sort of general deterioration in the EU's functioning, but it will somehow carry on as a. I mean, you know, Macron, after all, has said that Europe faces a crisis, which it can only solve by becoming more efficient, more centralized. Well, that just doesn't seem to be happening. And the COVID crisis, which has shown up every country, well, most anyway, possible exception of South Korea or somewhere, you know, it's certainly shown the EU as not being a very effective system.
Yes, and as usual, a crisis that can only be solved by Emmanuel Macron. That's sort of how it tends to work with Macron. Everything is framed in terms of this great crunch point, which he has the answer to. If you are just joining us, you joined us in the last few moments, we're talking about Robert Tomb's fascinating new book, The Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out of Europe. If you would like a signed copy arranged, please email us at editors@reaction.life, or you can, of course, buy the book online. It is published tomorrow. We've got lots of questions flowing in, so we're going to move to some audience questions. A question from Andrew, which is about I did a chat recently, a couple of months ago, with Neil Ferguson, where we talked about, and I'm a unionist, and he was trying to say that that the only way to peace was acceptance, and that it might simply be the case that it's the nature of countries that nothing lasts forever. Interested in your view on that. And I was going to ask you, is there a danger of you seeing this primarily through the prism of England, in the context of your history of England, and views are obviously very different in Scotland. Scotland is a Remain country. Wales voted narrowly, which somehow is deemed as not counting, although it did vote for Brexit. But is there a risk of an Anglo obsession on your part?
Yeah, there is a risk, which I try to counter, but I'm not sure that I always succeed. But I think the Welsh vote is important because it shows that this is not simply an English vote versus a non-English vote. And I say in the book, which I think is perfectly clear, that that Scotland and Northern Ireland are really the outliers in Europe. There are very few, if any, European states in which support for the EU is as high as it appears to be in Scotland. And the reason is clear to me, that independence for Scotland requires the EU. It requires Scotland to be an EU member state. And of course, this is pretty obvious. The EU has been for a long time encouraging a degree of regional independence, which you might think is a good thing, but it has been. And for countries like Scotland, and indeed for countries, if you like, or provinces like Catalonia, and I've made this comparison occasionally, the idea of being an independent state within the EU is very attractive, because it seems to be risk-free. You know, you're defended, you have your trade negotiations done for you, you're part of a big gang in the playground, as it were. Whereas to become independent outside the EU is pretty unattractive. So although, and I hesitate to pontificate on Scotland, because I don't pretend to know Scotland well. It just seems to me that for Scottish independence, as long as the UK was in the EU, could well have been inevitable, or at least was not unlikely. Scottish independence, now that we're outside the EU, seems to me to be completely impractical. However much some Scots, or even many Scots, would like it to happen, it seems to me it's just not on.
Though ironically, the SNP I'm not disputing that there are serious problems at the border, but the SNP making as much as possible of the borders with the EU, that has the obvious implication that if Scotland was independent, and it would essentially be dealing with England on the basis that France or Holland is now. So those problems would exist at the border. The new border would be with with the EU would be with Scotland. The Christopher Moga QC says, what's the likely impact of the trade agreement and bilateral trade agreements, so on this theme, with other countries upon the SNP's campaign for independence? I suppose you have to also see how the vaccine thing works as an argument, whether it's something which endures as an argument, that the SNP suggesting that it wants to leave the UK vaccination program and join the EU vaccine procurement program, which doesn't. But it may be that those differences iron themselves out or are smoothed out over the course of two or 3 years.
Yeah, probably. But I think, okay, the vaccine question has brought a lot of things home to a lot of people. But I think that if Brexit is reasonably successful, and we do have trading relationships with closer trading relationships with other parts of the world. And after all, most of our trade is with other parts of the world. Most of our trade is outside the EU. That the idea of leaving, okay, let us hope, an economically successful and politically stable United Kingdom in order to join an increasingly shaky and unstable EU would seem to me to be more and more unattractive to Scots. Now, what we don't want, and here I suppose I speak as an Englishman and a Briton, is to have a United Kingdom in which a considerable part of its population is discontented with being members of that polity. That's not a desirable thing to do. And in some cases, you might say, well, look, if people often say, English people often say this, if the Scots really want to be independent, well, why don't they? Better that than to have a continuously discontented Scotland, which is within the UK. And,
what then happens to England, though? What is England? Well, England, Wales, and
Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland in a moment. Is it branded as the rest of the UK? Can it claim that it should still have its UN Security Council seat? What is England?
Well, let's hope we never have to find out. But England has existed for a long time before the United Kingdom. England is the predominant, is probably, well, I think this is pretty clear if you look at the history of population figures. England is now much more important within the British Isles than it was 200 years ago. England would evidently continue as a major state without Scotland, and indeed without Northern Ireland. I think it would be very regrettable, because I think many of us are attached to the idea of the United Kingdom as a multi-ethnic or multinational kingdom. And of course, it has been now, it is now quite an old one. You could say, well, these things are predestined to break up. I don't think there's any predestination. I mean, the problem is that the dominance of the SNP and the division of the Unionists in Scotland mean that Scottish politics is now much more separate from British politics than it has ever been since the 18th century, I suppose. I don't know what you do about that.
What about the question of Northern Ireland? Do you think that Brexiteers have been too cavalier with Northern Ireland, now it's essentially divided on trade grounds from the rest of the United Kingdom? Gavin Rice asks, what does Robert think is the medium to long-term outlook for Northern Ireland? The protocol was always going to have teething problems, but it really does seem not to be working. Could Brexit push Northern Ireland into a border poll? Does Northern Ireland, essentially being in the single market, make Irish unity inevitable?
I think this was always the most dangerous part of the agreement, and always known to be so. And I think it was very unfortunate, to put it mildly, that the May government agreed to the principles of a Northern Ireland protocol, because I think, again, had there been goodwill on both sides, it would have been possible to solve the border issue. But I think, okay, some people, many people say the EU was genuinely worried about the border, genuinely worried about peace in Ireland and so on. But I think, there's a lot of evidence that the EU saw this as a tool it could use against the UK, and did use it. I think we have to, it will take a few months to see how this works out. And if the government is able or is determined enough to say, well, we are not going to allow this division between Great Britain and Northern Ireland to be perpetuated. And it also depends, of course, on the Irish themselves, the Northern Irish themselves. As we know, the government is committed to holding a border poll if it seems likely that most people want a change of status. I mean, I believe that it depends which poll you look at. People often say, do you think that Ireland will become united in 50 years? And they say yes. And then you say, do you think it will become united in 10 years? And they say no. And I think people often say that they don't actually themselves want it. So, as in the case of Scotland, I think nationalist politicians have managed to build up some sort of sense of impetus towards independence of Scotland or unification of Ireland, which I don't think in practical realities are anything near as likely as some of the headlines would want us to believe.
So Alex McFarland says less than 10% population loss. I think that's just aimed at Scots like me. So, but Alex sounds pretty Scottish. But yeah, I wonder if it's a bit more than that. Well, certainly the numbers are correct, but something else culturally and in security and defence and intelligence terms potentially is lost.
Yes.
Patrick Barrow asks, what explains this yawning chasm between populaces across Europe who become less enamored with the whole setup and their political class, who seem to see it as a vital and right in all senses? Is it now simply sunk cost because of, as you said, because of the euro, or something more potentially?
Well, I think a real answer to that question would be a very complex one, and in a sense, we can only answer it in a coherent way by hugely simplifying. I mean, I think there's enormous variety of reasons why people in different countries and politicians in different countries are committed to the idea of the EU. Partly acquiescence in what seems unchangeable, partly fear of the consequences of a breakdown, partly advantages for their own country if they're lucky, partly a sense that their own careers would be destroyed if they took on an anti-EU view. So I mean, and also, you know, genuine idealism that this is a wonderful project to unite the European continent, to preserve European culture, all that sort of thing. So, you know, mix all those things together and you've got a quite powerful but very complicated mixture.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that clearly there has been a developing gulf between political classes and citizens almost everywhere at least across the democratic world. I don't know that you can discuss it in the same terms outside the democratic world, where you might say the gulf already exists, but it's coped with in a very different way. In our
Great.
case, we rely on people. You know, we rely on people actually to support the system voluntarily. And I think globalization, the problems of the, you know, ever since the financial crisis, in the case of the EU, the appalling problems caused by the single currency are what have caused people to lose confidence in their elites. And the elites can't offer a way out, and hence have to stick to what they've been committed to for 2 or 3 generations.
I think the vaccine mess and the aftershocks of the pandemic, I think it's really politically just begun. Similar, I mean, it's similar to the financial crisis, maybe, but worse, in that the argument for the transnational approach was, you don't need to worry about this, we've got it.
Yes.
Because we as a technocratic class understand how these things work, and it operates at a sophisticated level above you, and you get the benefits, but you don't really get a say in how it works.
Yes.
And that, as is always the case with the technocratic approach, that only works if it works.
Precisely. Yeah.
And it's James Bradley asks a brilliant question, but it's actually impossible to answer, but it's a very good question. Would the People's Vote campaign have been possible had the Trump-inspired storming of the Capitol happened first? So if there are, I know that there are reaction subscribers on this call who marched for a second referendum and will be appalled at the comparison, but it is a good question, isn't it?
It is a good question. I think different countries have fundamentally different political cultures. And even if some of the grievances and the causes of division are the same, the way they're expressed through politics is very, very different. And I think you can see that. Okay, you can see that very clearly if you compare us with America. You know, people like comparing, or some people like comparing Boris Johnson with Trump. And to the extent that that comparison is possible, it rests on the sense that they are both expressing similar popular grievances. but the way they express them is so entirely different. I mean, we talked about Emmanuel Macron before. He too is a kind of populist, but he expresses it again in a very different way. One of the things that did make me, proud to be British was that even at when we were getting most angry with each other over Brexit, the level of, well, there was no violence, or no significant violence. It was pushing and shoving outside Parliament and people shouting through megaphones, and that was about it. But what you see in America, and what indeed we've seen in France, and the other day in the Netherlands is the sign of a much more I don't know what the word is, a much less restrained and much less civil political culture than we fortunately have inherited from generations of democratic politicians.
But there was political murder in the referendum.
There was Joe Cox, the death of Joe Cox. Yeah, there was. But then, the guy who killed her was mentally disturbed. I think that was clear, and had no connection with any British political movement. He was he was interested in American and South African Nazis. Had he been a Brexiteer in any real sense, and had he been a member of UKIP or anything like that, then we would have been looking at something very, very serious. Okay, it's very, very serious, but it's a different kind of seriousness. It's a deranged individual carrying out a meaningless act of violence. And I don't think that can be compared with what's happened in America on a number of occasions now in the last few years, or even with the Gilets jaunes in France, in which, after all, several people lost their lives. Had that happened in this country, we would feel that we were on the verge of social meltdown. But we're not used to that kind of violence, and fortunately, we don't tolerate it.
So one reader who wants to remain anonymous, I don't know why, but it's a good question. I think the UK always viewed membership as a transactional thing, driven largely by the Dean Acheson assertion that we had lost an empire, etc.
Yeah.
And that for economic reasons, we needed a dose of European post-war growth. I mean, but there were also in that brilliantly revealing book, I always think one of the key texts, which is this blessed plot by Hugo Young, where he approvingly explains how the Foreign Office did it and how they got us in. It's more than just that, isn't it? There is a small group who really believe that this is destiny.
Yes,
it's not just, well, we can have the opt-outs and this will be good for growth. There is something, we're lost as a country.
Yes.
We are lost in decline, and we have to subsume ourselves in Europe.
Yeah, but I think, well, I rather guess the question was partly getting at that. There's this sense of, as was it Dean Acheson, Britain has lost an empire and hasn't found a role.
Yes.
And I think the sense that the country was on the slide, economically, politically, losing influence in the world, meant that we had to attach ourselves to the EEC. You might say, well, what's happened since? And the obvious answer is that the EU has not turned out to be what enthusiasts in the 1960s thought it would, and we are no longer feeling ourselves to be the sick man of Europe. So I think the whole logic has changed. But I do think that the genuine feeling that, as you say, that you found in the Foreign Office was very much linked to the sense that Britain was a country in decline. And for them, the patriotic thing to do was to attach us as fast as possible to this new dynamic European system. I mean, the irony is that as soon as we joined it, it lost its dynamism. And the reason is that its dynamism was essentially short-term. It was the consequence of post-war recovery, of economic modernization, of rather backward economies, and a quick once and for all removal of trade barriers. But once that had been done, Europe's been pretty lackluster economically.
Our anonymous attendee also makes the brilliant point about the difference in the way that we view it from our European neighbours. When asked what has kept the peace in Europe, we say NATO, and many on the continent say
Yeah.
the EU.
Yes.
Linda Beskine makes the point, for years I hosted French teachers on exchange. Around 2013, 14, one visitor was listening to the radio and was shocked to hear the open criticism of the EU on mainstream media, and said that would not happen in France. Is there a block on debate about the EU in their media? I mean, they do have, or the way in which the debate is controlled by media in France, is that an influence? I mean, they do have fairly lively arguments about the EU. Would never, I'm not sure would leave it, but or would advocate leaving it. But
I think that's a good point, though, because it's endlessly repeated by foreign commentators that the reason for Brexit is because the English tabloid press was constantly hostile to the EU, and some of it was. Some of the mainstream press was very pro-EU, but I think it's true that on the continent there is much less criticism of the EU. At least there has been until.
yes.
And so I think most people do get only a rather Bowdlerized version of EU politics.
Mm. Furhan Asman asks a great question. What's your personal view on what Parliament did, and particularly on the Speaker, John Bercow? Who's John Bercow? I can't remember. On John Bercow's efforts in trying to overturn the Brexit vote. Did you get angry
Yes,
during it?
I did quite. Yeah, I thought it was completely. Well, I'm a historian. I thought it was historically completely unjustified. If you think about it legally, even, but you think of the way our politics has developed over the centuries. It has been moving away from oligarchy and towards democracy. And even when it was an oligarchy, there was never any attempt to well, never. I mean, the people's will was always taken as being very significant, even when we're talking about medieval parliament or the Great Reform Act, or of course giving the vote to women. People's wishes outside Parliament were always taken by the oligarchy, even when it was a fairly small aristocracy, as having major weight, and that public opinion was always thought to be important. And I thought the attempt by the House of Commons to, first of all, to claim that it was the sovereign itself was completely unjustified. And its attempt to take over the role of the executive on the grounds that Parliament could do anything was again completely unjustified and historically quite completely wrong.
Mm. Mm.
I did get annoyed. Yeah, I did get annoyed. And I thought it was extremely dangerous that they were playing with fire, and the consequences were potentially very serious. I'm not saying that there would have been a kind of Trump-style march on Parliament, because we don't tend to do that sort of thing very much.
Mm.
But I think, more likely there would have been a complete disillusionment of people who voted in the referendum, who often didn't normally vote, but who felt that this was their say, and who would be told in effect that their opinion was not desired, and that whatever they said, it was not going to be done, because there were people who knew best and who would make the decisions for them. And I think that was potentially very, very damaging.
I suppose I had a rather romantic. Well, I was going to say it was romantic, but maybe it's a Whiggish view. That it seemed to me, in historical terms, it seemed to be very. It's fascinating the way you said at the end of the book that you're not sure it will turn out to be this massive historical breach, which it certainly felt like that when we're living through. But I saw it in terms of, well, about authority and where authority lies, but arguably even in terms of the Reformation, and it's the first time since then. And I can think of a Jacobite friend who's certainly on this call watching, who'll dispute this, but about the European Union being so transgressive in British historical terms because it was about obligation to a higher authority lying beyond English or British shores.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, this takes us back to whether or not our history and our political culture is fundamentally inimical to EU membership. Um, and I suppose my answer would be yes, it probably is, but that might not have been enough to do the trick, as it were. Because I'm a European historian. I think what Poland, Hungary, Italy, France all have very heroic histories of struggles for national independence and democracy,
Yeah,
and yet they're willing to stay in the EU, at least for the time being.
yeah,
So I hesitate to say it's because we're different. There's the Europeans on one hand who are willing to put up with this kind of thing, and there's us on the other hand, and we don't. Um, well, that in a sense has proved to be the case, but then the question is, it can't be wholly down to our history, because if you're a Pole, you fought over and over again for national independence, and
yes. Yes, that's the danger of the British exceptional, or the
yes,
primarily the English exceptional
yes.
view of history, isn't it? Which is to then disregard the extraordinary power and achievements of France, or the complexity of the Spanish legacy.
And as I said, our views of the EU were not very different from those of most other European countries. So I think one has to look at the circumstances, the accident of our being given
Yeah,
a decision to make.
we were just naughty and we had a vote.
Yeah,
Couldn't
and
catch on.
we wouldn't change it, which is what you're supposed to
That was
do.
the really naughty thing. So a couple of quick, just before we round up, and again, highlight this fascinating book. Really recommend it. Out tomorrow, The Sovereign Isle, Britain in and out of Europe. A couple of quick points and also for observations. So many questions we didn't get through. So apologies if we didn't get to your
Well, I apologize
question.
for giving too long answers.
No, the brilliant answer, but there's so many questions. Charles Rusbasan, many Americans have almost completely bought into the Remainer view and fear for peace in Europe. The US press has a very anti-UK slant. Any thoughts?
Well, I can see why the American political establishment wanted us to stay in, because they always wanted us to be in, because we were going to be their principal defenders and spokesmen within the EU. Or as Charles de Gaulle put it, the American would be the American Trojan horse. So I can see why American governments would have liked us to stay in. But I've found it rather mystifying that American people, or at least maybe the American people are not represented by the New York Times or the Washington Post, but that American people should not apparently understand why the reasons for the leave vote. That I find difficult to understand.
I have to say, I mean, it was primarily Washington and New
Yes.
York, but talking to people in the US when it was feasible and legal and practical to actually visit that great country, I tended to find that they were curious about it, and it was portrayed in media terms as just as a mess
Yes.
and as a sort of PG Woodhouse scripted farce featuring Boris,
Yes.
who they found perplexing.
Yeah.
But that if you explained it in terms of, right, imagine NAFTA as something much more, with a commitment to political integration and to becoming one perfect whole, and that above the US Supreme Court sits something bigger. And if you explain it in those terms, it seemed Republicans and Democrats seem to instantly get it in the spirit of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. So we've got then one good question about rejoining. Given that it's quite possible that the EU, this is from Julian Child, given that it's quite possible that the EU will split into an inner and outer ring as the economic divergence caused by the euro leads to unbridgeable imbalances, do you think it plausible that the UK might join as a looser outer ring and associate status, a bit more like the common market or the EEA, with some say over the rules?
Well, I think there is a possibility of the EU becoming a sort of multi-tier system, whether planned or unplanned. And I think the French would always quite like the idea of our being one of their satellites in the outer ring. I think it would entirely depend on the terms. If it was going to mean that Britain would be a rule taker, which would essentially allow its main political and economic directions to be determined by the EU, but without having much of a say in it, and in return being allowed to buy a huge amount of EU goods,
Yeah.
well, I don't think there'll be much in it. If the EU decides that it really wants a close and cooperative association of equals between us and them, or at least which respects our interests and our different wishes, then yeah, why would we not want to cooperate when it's in our mutual interest? But I think that's not the same as being in a sort of outer satellite of the Brussels star.
And we won't hold our breath for that offer of reconciliation and cooperation from the EU. And I just,
Yeah, I
it's
know.
probably in the light of the last 5 years, it's probably going to be quite some time before there's much of an appetite in the UK for reopening things.
Yes. Well, I mean, I sort of thought there'd be, one day there'd be a point in which we'd say, right, well, we've got a deal. Now let's get back to normal relations. But then, as we know, it looks as though it's not going to happen, at least not in the immediate future.
Yeah.
I think it really depends on the EU accepting what's happened rather than being obsessed with maintaining its own cohesion. Because after all, Brexit was a huge blow to the EU project.
Robert Toombs, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of our subscribers for tuning in tonight. Our next event, and subscribers are invited, is the next edition of Answer Time next week, where we have a great lineup of guests. That's the new reaction political discussion show starting at 6 o'clock on Tuesday, the 2nd of February, Answer Time, which is sponsored by NatWest Group. So tune in then, and we'll be sending you an email in the next 24 hours. And you just need to click on that and register to get a ticket. Spaces are limited to 500 spaces. So when you get the email, please look out for it if you'd really like to join in. And that's a chance to then ask questions. And we'll be putting up tomorrow who the guests are and all of that. But until the next reaction event, until Answer Time, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Robert Toombs.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, everyone.